Shalom, loved ones. In this video, I'd like to offer some reflections on John chapter 20, verses 24 through 29. It's the scene that many of us know well when Jesus appears to Thomas, who had doubted what the other disciples had told him about Jesus' resurrection. I hope and pray that it blesses you. The title of these reflections is Doubters Welcomed. I have a confession to make. Sometimes I have doubts. When it comes to my history with doubting, I especially remember a season in my late 20s. Heather and I had moved to Barcelona with our daughter Megan, who was just a toddler at the time. We were there to serve at a church that was still very young. Within our first year, Heather had suffered a miscarriage, and in the months that followed, our marriage was not doing well, mainly because of my inattention to her and her needs. I poured myself into my work at the church, and the more I did so, the more distant we became. When it finally dawned on me how poor of a husband I had been, I began to question myself. I wondered whether my faith was authentic at all. In fact, I began to wonder if everything that we were doing in ministry was worth anything at all. And as my doubts began to cascade, I remember lying awake in bed one night when the thought struck me, what if we're wrong? What if all of this is just a lie? What if there really is no God? And everything we know about Jesus is just a bunch of stuff some folks made up a long time ago. Yes, I really had these thoughts. It was a real crisis. I began to wonder whether I would ever find my faith again, all while continuing to work at the church. That's when a friend I had made who wasn't a churchgoer asked me over for coffee one day, and she said, so tell me, how did you become a pastor? Was your father a pastor? So I told my friend about my life, how my family was definitely not in the ministry business. In fact, I told her our family was about as opposite to that as you could get. And then I told her how I had come to meet Jesus and how he had forever changed my life. And it was in that moment, as I was telling her my story, that I heard the Spirit saying deep to my heart, with loving gentleness, how could you, of all people, ever doubt that I am real? And just look at how your life changed. There's only one explanation for that. And it is because I am real. As I reflect on that experience now, I'm comforted by a truth that was there all along, even though I didn't realize it at the time. And it's this: God never stops loving us and accepting us, even when we are racked with doubt. In the company of Jesus, doubters are always welcomed. We can see this in the latter part of John 20, when Thomas doubted what the other disciples had told him about Jesus' resurrection. It had been at least a week since Jesus rose from the dead, but Thomas, for some reason, had yet to see him. And that's when Jesus appeared and invited Thomas to touch the wounds in his hands and in his side. And suddenly, Thomas could see for himself that it was all real. Jesus really had come back to life. So he exclaimed, "My Lord and my God." We often read what Jesus says next in this text as a condemnation of Thomas's doubt. And though Jesus tells Thomas to stop doubting and believe, at no point does Jesus load guilt upon Thomas for his doubting. He simply invites him to move beyond his doubt and make peace with what is real. Jesus is alive. Sadly, I'm convinced today that the church imposes upon doubters what Jesus never imposed upon anyone: guilt, condemnation, and shame for our doubts. I think Christians sometimes do this because the wrestling of others makes us very uncomfortable about our own faith. I remember a good friend telling me a story about this once. As an adult, she recalled the time she regularly accompanied a friend of hers to youth group when they were teenagers. Now, at this point in her life, Sharon, which is not her real name, was into some pretty edgy music. She regularly dressed all in black and wore makeup to affect a kind of goth look. As she attended youth group week after week, she became more and more interested in the Bible, so she started reading it for herself. And as she read, she began to write in the margins all the questions that she had, all the things that didn't make sense to her. And naturally, as the youth pastor spoke, she had even more questions week after week. So she would challenge him, as teenagers sometimes do. Well, this annoyed the youth pastor. So eventually he began treating her as an adversary. And then one evening, when he was speaking on the idea of spiritual battle, he asked her to come up to the podium to stand with him in front of everyone to make a point. And as she stood there next to him, he looked at the group and he said, "See here, this girl has the devil in her, and we need to cast him out." He said he was going to pray for her right there in front of everyone, but before he could start, she just looked him in the eye and said, "Fuck you." Now, pardon my language, but that is literally what she said. And with that, she walked out and vowed never to darken the door of a church ever again. How sad it makes me that the youth pastor could not recognize what a gift he had been given by all of Sharon's questions, by her habit of poring over the Bible and giving voice to her doubts In a time of her life when she was still gaining a sense of her own identity and struggling with who God is. How different it would have been if she had met the Spirit of Jesus in that place. A heart that would not heap condemnation, guilt, and shame upon her for her doubts. Often a believer's discomfort with questioning says more about the quality of the so-called believer's faith than about the nature of the questions themselves. By and large, Christian culture today is uncomfortable with troubling questions because so many Christians are, at the core, insecure in their faith. It takes a special kind of strength to make space for honest questions that trouble the deep waters of our souls. This is why I'm convinced we need more people who are willing to ask hard questions, not fewer. But instead, the church today likes to silence those who have doubts. Regular people like you and me who are looking for a space where we can wrestle with doubt in the open. My hope is that our little community, PlayWell, can be just such a space as this, a space where doubters are embraced in the Spirit of Jesus. A space where people who are going through the sometimes painful and confusing process of faith deconstruction will be met with love, patience and understanding, hope and companionship. A kind of playfulness in the spirit of wonder, not judgment. One of the ways that we try to do this in our PlayWell network is through the special way we practice listening to one another. As we listen, we refrain from the violence of doctrinal coercion and seek to enter the heart and mind of the sharer, respecting the process that each person is experiencing in their journey with God, without demanding that they need to be in the same place you are in. It takes a strong person to hold space for another like this, to simply bear witness to their wrestling with God, to sit with them in the midst of the tension without feeling the need to resolve the tension before they are ready. We are able to do this, though, as we remember that we are all just a bunch of ragamuffins doing the best we can to follow Jesus with all the mess of our doubts and dreams, imperfections and gifts, strengths and weaknesses, struggles and victories. So dearly beloved, let us be gentle with ourselves when we are wrestling with our faith. Let us embody the welcome that Jesus extends to all people, regardless of their doubts. May we see the gift that doubt can be, opening us up to the potential of wonder, leading us to richer understandings of who God is and how God is at work in us and in our world. May we be open to the kind of deep change that hard questions can nurture in us. May we hold one another tenderly and patiently in our doubting. And when we don't have the answers, may we, as the poet Rilke says, be given the grace to just live the questions. Above all, May we always remember that with Jesus, doubters are always welcomed and beloved. Amen and amen.